here's what I want to say. One, it's very nice to meet you. I've been looking forward to this. I'm thankful that I was able to get connected with you through Rory, and I've been looking forward to this conversation for a while. And I want it to be, and my hope for you is just very conversational. That's how I like to do my podcast. That's how I'm most comfortable. I hope you're comfortable that way. So
sounds great. I'm wearing short sleeves, so it's the best I got.
Sweet. Well, I'm wearing a black T-shirt. It is a wardrobe that I embraced. The start of COVID is like, if I'm going to be on Zoom every day, I don't have to worry about what shirt I pick out and that I don't have sweaty pit stains. So I'll just have black on and it's all good. Which is
efficiency.
Well, I embrace the Steve Jobs effect. And it's like, I can roll with this. My efficient brain is like, let's go. But going back to the comment about Korea, and you were talking about Asian culture, amazing people, such kind people, embracing people. The issue we had is for them to be transparent with us, because so often we're finding in challenges in business is they were afraid to tell us the truth. And working with a translator, and it was just kind of like, we'll figure this out. Like, no, we're here to help you, to guide you, to be with you. And that was the challenge we had. And so it was a great learning experience. It was a great, I think, leadership learning, whenever you go through that. But that's what we found in South Korea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of the biggest things that I haven't been to South Korea, but one of the biggest things that I've learned just traveling around the world, speaking all these different countries, is sort of as leaders, people have a natural desire and sort of tendency to take what works wherever they grew up, whatever's comfortable and normal to them, and then drop that into another geography or another culture or even just another industry or business, and it without taking the time to really understand it, deeply understand that, bring in people that can help create, in our line of work, we call it generational context.
Sure.
But the idea to be able to look through it with many different lenses so that you can then approach it in a very educated way. And it's tough. Where I find it the most difficult is for people who have been very, very successful. They often assume they can just take what they've done somewhere that they were really successful and drop it somewhere else and it's just going to work. We see this in the self-help world a lot. Yeah. Somebody's really good at one thing, and we call it the guru complex, which is you're really good at one thing, so therefore you're good at everything. And as my wife will tell you, I can't hang a painting. There's tons of things that I'm terrible at. And so fortunately for me, between her and my 10-year-old daughter, I've been very grounded to stick in my topic of generations. Only stay there.
Well, this is not meant as a mock of you or Rory, but I see what you guys have in common. That's what the joke is, that AJ will hang stuff up and do all the, the carpentry work, whatever. And Roy's just kind of like, I can help you put on makeup. I can help you put on, all those things from what he learned from his mom. But,
I'm not good with makeup, but really good with a spreadsheet and
there you go.
Data tables.
You said something, and I don't want to lose it. To me, you talked about the arrogance. I'm going to call it arrogance because I believe it's arrogance, is when people think, hey, this works here. I'm just going to go slap it down over there and it's going to work. And to me, it's, and as you talked about that, it's like, okay, what are the factors there? Is it lack of connection? Is it lack of empathy? Is it, again, that arrogance, that thinking I don't have to, distill out what really works, what won't work? How does this different? We're all people, but yet we're all different. I'd love to know, deeper your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I see this happen a lot. Of course, in my world, I tend to see it through speakers that have a canned speech and they show up and they deliver it somewhere and then it doesn't go over well. And they're like, I didn't know why. And well, that's a highly regulated industry. They're legally not allowed to do 3 of the things you suggested. So I think that a lot of times it takes work to step back and get out of autopilot and really try to see the world, or at least seek to understand the world through those you're trying to influence and connect with. And I just think it's a hard thing for people to do. It takes work. I mean, I was just talking with a speaker right before you and I hopped on, and they're like, Jason, how did you know that client so well? He and I spoke at the same conference. I was like, well, I went to their website, read the social media. We did all our prep calls. I read their quarterly filings. And then I went and I read the news articles about them. And I go through this, and he's like, you do that for every client? I'm like, yeah. That's how I know so much about each of them. When you've done it 3,000 times, you start to appreciate the fact that, in this industry, you can't do that thing. Yet your favorite story absolutely will not connect there. And then in the example that you gave too, translation, slang gets crushed in translation. Inside jokes don't work. So really, just seeking to understand that. So I think that what sort of keeps people from it, one, is just lack of experience. In the biggest sense, I don't know that it's arrogance. I think that's a big word, but I think a lot of people don't, have the experience to know, oh, I can't just pick it up and drop it somewhere. If you know that and then you choose not to do it, then maybe you're arrogant, or at the very least lazy. And then I think we've lost so much empathy in the world, and empathy is very different than sympathy. And I think being empathetic to people and their experience and what they're bringing to everything that they do as best you can is really, really powerful. And part of that, just to be candid, is having diversity of influences. And to me, what that means is, being in situations where you're not always right or where you're not in the majority, surrounding with people that have different informed perspectives that may completely contrast with your own. And for me, that's been really important. I've lived in different places around the world and gone to school in different places, and certainly worked in so many, and really trying to seek to understand what other people see in the world and how they see different experiences. And I have to frequently talk with entrepreneurs about this. You don't have to agree with them. Nobody's saying agree, but take the time to at least understand. Maybe you'll get to agreement, maybe you won't. But if you take the time to really seek to understand and ask them, maybe they're a different political, belief than you. Maybe they have a different religious belief than you. Maybe they grew up under a different system of government than you did. That doesn't mean it's right or wrong. It's just different than yours. And for me, as a study of humans, I study human behavior, right? Specifically, but missing behavioral insights and tracking data. Like, what I really want to try to pull out is that nuance. Yeah. Like, what is that nuance? What am I losing? What am I missing that if I can just go a little bit deeper, I'll be able to sort of pull that forward, and that will actually change how I think about things. And so for me, anytime as a leader you're going into a new environment, it's really important to do the pre-work to try to understand it as best you can. It's never going to be perfect, but taking the time to do that. The other thing I find is oftentimes, I see this in corporate boards because I work with lots of corporate boards, is people want to just join a board and then tell everybody what they think. Like, which by the way is the worst thing you can do. I know how to run your business better than everybody here who's been doing this for 20 years. Like, that's bad. Like, hold on. Take the time to listen before you start, preaching. And so those sorts of things, again, it's taking that pause to not make an assumption. And just sort of take it all in instead. For me, I think that's really important. So
all of this is me getting to you. It has nothing to do with the podcast I want to talk about, but I love this. And I want to ask you, well, no, but I mean, I say that is honestly. So one of my last guests last week was Don Yeager. Don Yeager and I got to be good friends. I don't know if you know who Don Yeager is or not. And one of the things that Don has, complimented me in the past is like, Tyler, you prepare. And I'm like, well, yeah. I mean, and I've worked a lot with John Maxwell and mentorship there. And the things that you pull out of it is like, those are the things that I see John doing and learn from him. It's like, of course you prepare. I mean, I read your book last fall. I just reread it. I made a lot of notes. I went through it. I studied about you. But I guess I would look at that from a standpoint of maybe it's my own ignorance. Like, you talk about speakers, and I understand, like Don and I were talking about a podcast host that didn't do that. And it's like, as speakers to go deliver to an audience, I'm like, how can you expect to add value if you're not going to do all the work beforehand to connect? It's kind of like, people that date, Gen Z dating is they're going to Google everyone and search them on social media before they ever go out on a date with them, right? Mm-hmm. I guess this has me intrigued because I feel this way. And as we bring this up, and to me, it's a core tenet of leadership. And you're signifying as you're seeing this as I don't know how we got started, which is crazy, but seeing this as a definitive point in gurus and leaders and people trying to serve others. It's almost, I don't want to say it catches me off guard in a way because I get it. But it's just, man, Jason, like, help me understand why there's so few that feel that way.
Mm-hmm. Sure. I think on one hand, to me, I didn't finish high school or college, which a lot of people don't know. It's sort of funny. I was just asked to join the board of my daughter's school, and I've been asked to join the board of trustees of a famous university. I turned down both, by the way. The thing that's interesting to me is like preparation is the price of entry for excellence. That's sort of how I think about that, right? In the sense that if I truly want to do a good job and I want to honor my time and those that are participating, do the work.
Yeah.
What's intriguing to me is not that people don't do it. What's intriguing to me is people who know they should do it and still don't, and are like, oh, we can wing it. That's always sort of fascinating to me, just as a study and how committed are they to their craft or their message or the impact that they want to deliver. But sort of bigger picture, I think, so often now it's very easy to sort of superficially know people, which was to your example on Gen Z dating, but really all dating, by the way, now.
Yeah.
People have gotten accustomed to not only do they start many relationships, the majority of all relationships through online dating, but they're going to check out the person. They're going to, follow them. They want to be friends. Oh, if you won't be friends with me, then are we really dating? Like, there's all that sort of jazz definitely going on. But I think now what we see, the youngest generations, like what we study, Gen Z and also millennials, they're accustomed to going online to seek truth. Now whether or not it's accurate or true is a whole nother debate. But there's definitely this sort of knee-jerk reaction of, oh, so-and-so wants to meet you. Or it could be as simple as, I might want to work there. I'm going to go find out about them. Or their brand or product says they're good for the environment. I'm going to go see, is that really true? Like that sort of stuff. There's no questioning about, should I go online and look for it? In fact, what we study is not just, do you go online, but where do you go? Do you go to YouTube? Do you go to Snapchat? Do you go to Instagram? Where are you on TikTok? I mean, I just was on a national TV show talking about Gen Z trusts TikTok for financial advice more than other outlets, right? So
crazy.
So if you've been conditioned as a generation to find information online, primarily, by the way, through your phone, not even through a laptop or tablet, then that is your path to truth. That doesn't mean you still won't vet it with friends and family and maybe experts, however you define that. But what's interesting is in one of our studies we did on Gen Z, who, by the way, is already 23, 24, maybe even 25 years old, what we found with Gen Z is that many times how they define an expert is different than other generations. So they might define it as somebody who has a bigger following on certain social media versus having a PhD or being a CEO or something else. They also connect relatability to somebody being an expert. Oh, do you really understand my life? Therefore, you're a better expert, in sort of the problems that I have or the questions that I have. So the filter they're bringing to it is really powerful and so important for brands and leaders to know as they think about sort of what they're going to put out in the world online in particular. But what I find super fascinating, and I think about this a lot, is how we all have this sort of path to truth that we're going on. Is it TikTok? Is it Facebook? Is it YouTube? Is it Wikipedia? Is it calling up your grandpa and being like, do you remember this? Control came out. Is it true that people would walk up to the TV and turn the knob? Like, whatever.
Yeah.
But with just sort of understanding, most of that's conditioned. There were people that went and got the encyclopedia. So it's very easy to say, well, clearly people are going to go the same route as we are, which is back to the original conversation, sort of taking something that worked in one place or in one situation, dumping it in and think it's going to work, is the same way thinking, oh, well, they're going to go figure this out the same way I will. That's completely false. And just being open to that is really exciting when you go, oh, wow, people are all looking at the world differently. And that doesn't mean they're right or wrong. It's just different than mine. And what can I learn from them if I sort of hang out and try to take on that point of view?
To me, that last point has probably only accelerated with millennials and Gen Zs, because you think about it. So I'll be 42, was born in 79. You're similar age. Like if we wanted to go find information, it was a book, whether that was an encyclopedia, a library, maybe going through those like scan file, whatever, found stuff on newspapers. That's how you'd find information, or you'd ask someone. And now I think about it, as you talk about my kids who are, in that Gen Z, they're 13, 14, 11. And it's funny, we'll talk about something and they've already YouTubed it, Googled it. I mean, they've gone through all this, whatever they discern. But the key part there is when we looked at an encyclopedia, we believed it. We didn't have a filter that was right or wrong. If it was in a book, you have to believe it, right? If it's in a newspaper, you have to believe it. Whereas I wonder how much, as you bring this up, the Gen Z, because they have this filter that they don't even realize where they get to discern. It's almost like this deciphering code between what's real and what's not. Because I look at that and it's kind of like when you talk about social media and TikTok, it's like, all right, who do I trust and who don't I trust in this filter that they start to create? Have you guys done much research into like how they filtered, or is it like they don't even inherently know, they just do?
Yeah, no, they're fairly aware of it depending on their age. Because we would just ask them, take us through the journey of trying to solve this problem, or learn about a brand, or find a potential employer, or determine if you want to open a bank account. And, we can track them because there's tons of analytics out there that will take us down that path, particularly as you go further down the funnel where there's more attribution. But at a high level too, when you ask them about where did they start, what do they trust, and you get that great data, particularly if it's very recent, like from today, if you were to do this, or give them a problem, it tends to be fairly consistent in many parts of the world. By the way, it does vary based on geography, and I know you're familiar with our work. One of the things we talk about so much is that generations vary around the world. And there's sort of this myth that if you're a boomer in the US and you're a boomer in India, you have very similar preferences, and it's not true. Now, what we've actually proven is that the younger you go, the more consistency there is in the world because of free or cheap or inexpensive mobile devices. And as we've driven down the cost of smartphones in particular, some parts of the world now you get a phone for free if you use it for payment. So think of it like a bank or credit card, and then you get the phone benefit for free. So there's more similarity than ever before. But at the same time, there's still important geographic differences. So yes, we can figure out how each generation sort of goes to look for answers. And by the way, it varies based on what it is. So if you're going to buy your first house, who you're going to talk to and how you're going to go down that path is going to look very different than if you're going to buy sneakers. And so being aware of that, the situation you give, you'll get different answers. The thing that concerns me the most as somebody who's a researcher of this is when it comes to certain things like ideology, politics, just, broad views of the world, the way the algorithms work in social media is whatever you obviously respond to the most, it serves you more of. And so you end up in this big echo chamber, which unfortunately, not just for young people, but for all generations, can really distort the view of the world. It becomes highly polarizing, as we've clearly seen played out here recently, because you feel like everybody is, has the same view. And if they don't, clearly they're almost like the enemy. And the more they create this us versus them mentality, the more engaged you are and the more upset you are at the other group. And, you sort of this rush to the polar ends is really problematic as we actually work to find, connection and unity and trust and work together to solve problems that it turns out we're really not that far apart on. It becomes much harder when your whole view of the world and sort of your filter for truth is through digital platforms that want you to be polarized, right? That want that emotional charge. And so that's the sort of thing. Now, by the way, that's not just social media, just to be crystal clear. It's the same thing that plays out in cable news, plays out in many of the outlets, even plays out in educational groups. I mean, there's a lot there you could unpack. But at the end of the day, I think what's interesting is by generation, you can see how people go to learn about, engage the world, and find their truth. And then as humans do, by the way, this is not a generational thing, humans tend to seek reinforcement of what they already believe. It's the most comfortable thing. So the more we dismiss something that we don't agree with and go, see, I told you that. We found this one thing over here. And so, we seek that, and there's lots of psychology around that. But what gets me excited, though, at the end of the day, is when you look across generations, people still want to be valued. They want to be included. They want to have a purpose in their life. They want to feel challenged, like they're actually, learning and growing. And I think we're still a lot more alike than we are different. It's just we focus so much on the differences, and I think we tend to dwell on things that we're, really different on. We can lose sight of what brings us together. And, my whole work, the talk that I primarily give is called Crossing the Generational Divide, because what I'm trying to do is celebrate each of these differences that we do see, honor them, right? Be excited about them. But at the same time, we can all still work together. We can create great customer experiences, great employee experiences, great team member experiences, drive innovation. I mean, we need diversity of thought to foster innovation. It's not going to happen otherwise, right? And so the more that we can see that we can work together, we can get along, we can solve some of these big problems. Not all of them, right? There's things that are just sort of intractable. But generally speaking, there's a lot, we can make a lot of progress if we're willing to have those conversations. And for me, if I can help put people sort of in possibility and humanize what's going on, then we can have those. And that's super exciting. That's what gets me fired up,
Well,
for the work that
that's what gets me excited. And it's funny, I kind of getting into this now, and a bit of and we talked about having a conversation, and this has been a fun conversation. Like I come to these to learn, and that stuff I'm learning. And the first time I heard you was Global Leadership Summit, and I'm like, oh, that's really great stuff. And then, as your book came out, and it's like I had to get it and excited to get it and dug into it. And I'm like, this to me is, leapfrogging the experiences we had with millennials to get farther ahead. But this is the biggest thing that I kind of want to hang on the last thing you said is as we evolve as leaders in businesses to attract, market to, and lead Gen Z, we're only getting better serving people because there's a higher, there's like a higher demand. There's a higher level that Gen Z demands that every baby boomer, every Gen Z, every millennial is going to appreciate. Hey, you're going to have better marketing that's more targeted towards me. You're going to care about me as a person. You're going to connect with me. That's not going to ostracize a generation. It's going to embrace. And I think to me as a leader and seeing, as you talk about too, this, as a cusper, I think growing up in the Midwest, rural on a farm, I'm more of a Gen X because I never had cable until I got to college. And so I see this as you talk about it in your, it's on your breakdown of generations. Gen X, this millennial, is the glue. To me, it's the bridge between the generations. And the ability that we have as a generation to go from the baby boomers and really try to serve the Gen Z as a holistic, empathetic leadership group, man, we're going to have people bind together more than be ostracized. That's just my thought and opinion.
Yeah, and exactly. The way I think about it is, because I sort of preface as generations being clues, not a box. I know you've heard me say that a bunch of times, but I think that's really important. We don't put people in boxes. We try to find behavioral insights that that have been proven through data that allow us to better understand and sort of see the world through different groups. The trick is when we look at sort of youngest to oldest, Gen Z, or if you're listening outside the U.S., Gen Z, Gen Z or Gen Z is really the best preview of the future. Because what our research has shown at CGK, which is our research firm, the Center for Generational Kinetics, and I talk about this a lot in the new books, Economy, for the first time ever, technology trends are being driven from the youngest up to the oldest.
Yeah.
And this is a really important point because I work with our organizations a lot. They're like, no, Jason, we're fine. We can just stick with the millennials, Gen X, and boomers. And I'm like, no, you don't understand. It's not just about preparing to win Gen Z right now. What I'm telling you is if we don't win Gen Z, we're actually going to lose the other generations because they're becoming more like Gen Z. We see this through all their digital behaviors, how they communicate, how they think about how they shop, how they buy, how they pay, all of those things. So as you think about it that way, we're not asking people or organizations to cater or coddle to people. We're not giving out trophies, none of that nonsense. What we're really trying to do is seek to understand this new generation, their view of the world, what they're fired up about, how they want to connect and so forth, because that also gives us a preview of what we need to do with the other generations. And then the flip side is, when I speak with organizations or work with them and they have a lot of Gen Zers or millennials, we're doing the opposite, which is we're going to give them the secrets to be able to get promoted faster, drive more value, grow their sales, deliver better marketing, because they can do it in reverse, right? It's the same sort of thing. We're just teaching them the opposite end of it. And to me, that's what generations is all about. It's understanding yourself better, understanding others better, and then giving you truly the choice to say, I'm willing to try something different to create this outcome I want. And that's so important because it's always a choice. Nobody's saying to boomers, you got to go adapt to millennials, right? By the way, you raised them. And the Gen Zers who want to build great businesses, you can say, hey, you don't have to learn how to sell to Gen X or boomers. But if you don't, you're missing a huge market. Yeah. And to me, I think that's where this conversation becomes very healthy and stays away from the us versus them. You know, the Gen Zers making fun of the boomers. I was at an event recently and, Gen Z's like, oh, those boomers, they don't know anything about technology. I'm like, seriously? They invented the smartphone you're making fun of them on. Like that. It would not exist without them. And then the boomers like, oh, Gen Z, they just blow their money. I'm like, actually, their savings rates are very high. It turns out they're extremely frugal with their money. They have emergency savings accounts. They want to know about benefits from employers. Turns out they're a lot like you.
It's so fun. You talk about this in your book that, your wife's just a couple years older. Denise is, co-author.
6 years older. 6 years old.
Six. She's robbing the cradle. Look at you. I won't even go there. No comment. And then your daughter's Gen Z. And that's, again, myself. And I look at my kids and they're now starting to go through this, fiscal exploration, get them. What's funny is I started with a bank account when I was 8. I tried to get my kids set up and you can't. So, get them set up with Venmo, get them set up with those things because that was the option for them to be able to move money. And I wanted them to be able to handle it on their own. And just last night, I picked up my daughter and she went to the mall with her friends. And I'm like, all right, so what did you buy? And my wife gave her $100 cash. It's like, great, go use it. And she goes, oh, I didn't spend that. I spent $15, got a shirt. We were going to go thrift shopping. And I ended up using a gift card and got this purse. And she was excited about the fact that she didn't spend much. She had the money to spend. And it was kind of like her expressing this fiscal responsibility. And you talk a lot about that in the book. And I think that is, to me, it's going to be very interesting. I know that, as a generational, researcher, we have this worldwide event. And when was the last time we had a worldwide event that would define a generation? And COVID did that. And to see how do all of these, Gen Z and whatever it gets called, splinter out of it, how their activities, I think it's going to be enthralling. One, as a parent, but as a researcher, I can imagine it's like, all right, how does this start to creep out? How do they start to evolve and change? What can we learn from that?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. In this economy book, I talk a lot about how parenting, so there's different trends that we study that impact generations, parenting being one of them, technology, mobility, access to healthcare. We can go through a whole bunch. And then you have these generation defining moments, which are those sort of where were you when events. For millennials in the U.S., it could be 9/11. For other generations, it might be the JFK assassination or landing on the moon. We could go through a whole bunch of these, Challenger explosion and so forth. So sometimes you have those. In other parts of the world, you might have Brexit is actually a really big one for Gen Z, for example, in Europe. So as we think about these different events and what's going on with the pandemic, in the book, the fiscal piece is really interesting because what we find is that there's sort of two things that are going on. One, because Gen Z, particularly in North America and particularly in the U.S., came of age through the Great Recession, they really carry that with them. They felt the pain and the weight of their parents struggling, losing their house, losing their job. And even though Gen Z was young, they were only 12, 13 at most. What happened, though, is they were old enough to understand it, old enough to make different decisions because of that, and old enough to say, I'm going to learn from this, I'm going to bring it forward as an adult. Whether or not they consciously did that, that's certainly what we see play out. The story I always joke about is, Gen Z will have a birthday party, they're 16 years old, they'll get $50, they'll put the money away and they'll go back and ask their mom or dad, hey, can I have some money? I want to go buy something. And they'll say, well, the money you got for your birthday. And they'll say, no, that's my money. Yeah. I want to use your money, right? And also even with younger kids, like we use a green light card at our house. That's something we're really excited about. And it's so funny because my daughter gets $5 for allowance when she does her chores. My daughter's 10. And so I said to her the other week, I said, here's your $5. She's like, no, just put on my green light card.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, don't you want the $5? She's like, no. How am I going to spend this $5 on Amazon in cash? Like you can't spend cash on Amazon. Yeah. And it was so funny because I was like, wow, she is completely right that she can, not do anything with the cash that I just gave her. And it was really interesting to her that she connects money to something that's entirely digital, right? And to her, that's her bank, that's her spending, that's her goals. That's what she thinks about her future. So you certainly have that. And then now we have this pandemic, as you talked about, and we've led numerous studies. So we've led more than 65 generational studies around the world on everything you can think of, from cars and life insurance to hotels and travel to technology, direct selling, like you name it. We're into all these sort of different industries. And what we found with the pandemic is initially Gen Z, remember the oldest are now 23, 24-ish, Gen Z was the number one generation to lose their job, number one generation to have a reduction in pay, number one generation to have a reduction in hours, and the number one generation to have a change in their job role. So if they did get to stay, they had to do something else. And everybody kept saying, oh, the boomers are getting hammered the most, or Gen X or millennials, and it was totally not true. The youngest workers were the ones that really got hurt the most initially. They suffered from last hired, first fired. They often were in retail, hospitality, all those sort of frontline businesses that also closed down. They had the least political relationships or political capital within a business. So, they weren't the ones that got to stay. We can go through a whole bunch of things. And so there's plenty more to that too. But the bottom line is, the oldest members of Gen Z crashed into this. If they were at college or university, many times they had to come back home. Maybe they never got to leave. They didn't have graduation. They didn't get to intern, like all this, no summer jobs, the whole deal. And so what's interesting in our work is sometimes you have an event that can help to sort of split or in your words, splinter a generation. And so what we're seeing is that now here we are coming out on the other side of the pandemic, knock on wood, certainly here in the U.S., what we're seeing is that the oldest part of Gen Z has had just a really challenging experience, and we predict they're going to have 3 to 5 years of negative economic consequences at a minimum, right? Because if you're graduating college with a degree in, I don't know, hospitality management, and there are no jobs, it's just tougher for you. And we could go through a bunch of other examples of that. But here's where it gets super interesting. So those oldest Gen Zers had the rug pulled out from underneath them. Many times they had to move back home or stay home. They lost that independence, that self-reliance, that sort of those key years for them to get into the workforce. What's interesting, though, is if you go younger than that, and let's play it out, 10, 12, 15, even 16 years old, your experience was very different. Yeah, you went to homeschool or virtual school or hybrid school, and it was completely uneven around the U.S. and certainly across the world based on socioeconomics, single-parent household. Did you have a computer, or did you have a laptop? Did you have a smartphone? Did you have none of that? Like, there's so many things that made it massively uneven around the world. But what's interesting, though, is that the more runway you have before you have to jump off after graduation, the more opportunity you have to learn from those ahead of you. Sure. So you could say, hey, I'm not going to study those things, or I'm going to stay at home, or I'm going to do different things like that. So you actually have more runway to make different choices. Whereas those who were already 18, they were already out, right? Yeah. They couldn't make that back up. And so what we think could happen is sort of like what we saw with millennials, where the oldest millennials crashed into the Great Recession in the U.S., really struggled, wage stagnation, rising costs of living, higher unemployment rate, the boomerang, moving home, all that sort of jazz. But then if you look at the younger millennials, they benefited from a really robust recovery and had sort of the opposite experience. So even though they were the same generation, because of sort of where they hit that macro event, they had just frankly different experiences. We think that could happen with Gen Z because the younger ones, what did they learn? Well, my daughter goes to homeschool right now, so she's in school all day long, Google Classroom, and to her, it's now totally normal. It's been a year, right? You do your presentations, you do your math work, you do your science, you do whatever it is you do, and like that's just normal to her. So all of a sudden, learning is completely normal to do through screen. Does she love it? No, of course not. But she's gotten good enough at it where she can make it work, and she just keeps going. And I share that because this could be, in some ways, turn into an advantage through some of the skills that younger members of Gen Z have learned that they can then take forward with them. Now, there's the social and emotional weight of this pandemic on them is extraordinary. Yeah. We don't focus on mental health specifically, but at a high level, we do ask questions around that, and it has been really hard on the youngest generation. I know in our house, it's been very hard for our daughter. We have an older child. But what's really interesting, if you go even younger, check this out. For the first time ever, we believe we know where the next generation starts. The oldest of which are 2, 3, 4, maybe even 5 years old. Because for them, this pandemic has been a very different experience. Maybe one of their parents or both their parents were around a lot more. They got to be home, and it's just, they don't have they're not old enough to sort of contextualize what's going on, feel all those negative emotions and do all that. Because you have to be a certain age to really be able to do that. It's how we knew when millennials ended and Gen Z started. Millennials have to be old enough to understand what happened on 9/11. And if you're not old enough to do that, or it was always history, you're not a millennial. It's pretty simple. But that's why it's not actually, birth years, millennials don't end in 2000. You have to back up a few years. Because remember, those 2, 3, 4-year-olds still don't remember what happened on 9/11 unless, they were particularly close to it. So as we think about this, Gen Z, who we're closely studying right now, they're going through all these sort of key life stages, right? They're in adolescence, they're going into that early adulthood. They're now the fastest growing generation in the workforce. They will be for the next 15 years. They're going to start driving all these different trends. We've already seen it with tech adoption. We've seen it with banking. We've seen it with couponing. As you point out, we've seen it with dating. So there's lots of change that this generation is driving, but they're still early. And so, when I speak to executives or entrepreneurs, they're like, Jason, why do you talk about Gen Z so much? I'm like, because how many of y'all struggled with millennials? And like everybody raises their hand. They're like, even the millennials in there raised their hand.
Yeah, exactly.
Because you waited too long, You waited until they were a problem, and then you tried to adapt, and you're like, whoa, now I got to play this massive game of catch up, where right now you have this moment you don't have to do that. You can grow with the generation as they emerge, and that to me is what's so incredibly exciting. It only happens like literally once in a generation, and so this is the time to get to do it. That's why we're so passionate about it.
Well, I think what's cool about that is really it kind of I would guess and look back in your research between Gen X and baby boomers and the greatest generation, there were changes, but not as fast. And so management and leadership could evolve slowly through it. Whereas, the recent millennials in the workforce and how there's so much different how they learned, what they wanted, what they expected from a job. And now Gen Z, it's kind of like, oh, snap, this isn't the same old stuff. I need to address this differently, which I had someone refer this to me, and I want to ask you about it. Is one of the things that they theorize on this is that the older generations were more transactional. Come, show up a job, get paid, move on. Whereas the younger, millennials and especially Gen Z, they look at work as transformational. It's like, hey, I'm coming here to learn. I'm coming to learn. And I think a lot of that is how many people roughly our age went to college, got a degree, and then all of a sudden go to a job. It's like, oh, now I have to learn how to actually do the job that I went to college for because college didn't really teach me. And I think that was a lot of this millennial generation or even some of the younger Gen X. And so I wonder, as leaders, how much is now the opportunity to say, hey, we're here to really teach and transform and help people grow as part of our leadership culture. And that's part of our job and not just expecting them to come in and do their job and be happy.
Yeah. So I don't know who you had on, but I would disagree with their analysis.
Okay.
And the reason is if you look at longevity within an employer, it was dramatically longer with baby boomers, dramatically longer than with subsequent generations. Remember, boomers were the people that worked at the same employer 10, 20, 30 years, right? And that was normal. Job hopping is actually a newer phenomenon than people think. And what happened is, as Gen X was coming of age, Gen X came of age right when those boomer promises were really broken. And what I mean by that is companies had said, we'll employ you for life, and then we'll give you great benefits, right? And there was all sorts of things around employer-employee relationship and expectations. It was a job. If you went to IBM, you started there and you finished there, or General Motors or any of these places, right? My dad was laid off from General Motors. It's the oldest memory I have is him being laid off. And I remember him crying. My dad's a big guy. And even now we talk about it. He's like, that's the only job I ever wanted. All I ever wanted to do was work at GM, assembling chassis, and then he got laid off. So because of that, that's when the employer-employee contract really changed, was at the moment when they started breaking it. Initially it was employers for lots of different reasons. And then all of a sudden you saw the retirements change and other benefits. So Gen X came of age very skeptical. And they were the ones who said, hey, if this is not working for me, I'm going to look somewhere else. And that's okay because I saw what happened to the generation before me. Now, interestingly, when we survey Gen X a lot, Gen X still expects new hires that they bring on to hopefully work 2, 3 or more years, maybe even longer if you've got an opportunity there. Now, where it's out of sync is the younger you go, the shorter they think it is to be a loyal employee. That's just the reality of it. Oh, I want to try out some different things, see what works for me. But this is where I one of those findings that's so fascinating to me. What we started to see, though, over the last 2 years pre-pandemic was that Gen Z expected they'd have to work longer at a place in order to get promoted, in order to build a career. In fact, some of our really large employers who we get their employment data, prior to the pandemic, their Gen Z retention was actually better than their millennial retention. Because remember, millennials came of age and it was, go after the next job and stock options and, you can't move forward in your career unless you move around, which, by the way, statistically is not true. But that's sort of what stuck. And so people ran with that. Gen Z, we find, really seeks stability. They really want stability. Think about how much they've been through. So for them, stability is very important. In fact, we have to teach startups to talk about how stable they are if they really want to attract Gen Z, because Gen Z doesn't realize that there's stability around it. You could have a small business that's stable. You don't have to be a big business to be stable, right? Yeah. So to your other point about being transformational, I think that's very true. The expectation of employees, particularly the younger you go, is that they're going to get more from an employer than $1, right? Or just getting paid. And that you're in some way as an employer going to help them to develop their skills, develop their abilities, their talents, help them to sort of operate better in the world. And that puts a lot of pressure on employers because remember, employers aren't designed to do that. Right? Employers are designed to recruit and then retain and pay you and then move you over some career, advancement pathway until they think you've risen to as far as you can go, right? That's sort of the old typical corporate structure. Well, you've got Gen Z and millennials saying, no, we want flat structures and we want to work in cross-functional teams and I want to rotate to different jobs and like this whole thing, which is putting a lot of pressure. And I expect you to give me training opportunities that are going to develop my skills and help me to figure out what I want to do. And, there was this whole thing too, back in the because we work a lot in startups, as you know, venture capital, there was this perception for a while. People kept saying, view employees as doing a tour of duty. They're going to take a tour through your company, and then they're going to go somewhere else. And that's really hard for certain generations to get excited about, right?
Yeah.
But the flip side is if people see your company as really there to help employees to develop their talent and, become better people in the world and so forth, then you'll continue to attract great people.
Yeah.
The problem is when you don't do that and you lose employees, then you're in this awful cycle of struggling to hire because people don't see it as advancing their career themselves, and you're losing the talent that you do have. So we believe it's very important, and we teach a lot of employers, how do you create these talent development programs that are low cost, what we consider lightweight, but still deliver real value, so that without, being an imposition to that employer. Like I'm actually talking about this tomorrow to a big company in Canada through this webinar, is how do you develop talent development programs right now during the pandemic if you don't have anybody leading your talent program, right? Which is a fascinating conversation. Yes. Like, hey, you can build this whole thing for $0. I'll walk you through exactly how to do it. But it's just different because, of course, they think, well, we got to get in person, which we can't do. And we need a rigid curriculum, which we need fanciest. I'm like, no, we don't need any of that stuff, right? This is a generation that goes to YouTube to learn everything. Like, we can totally make this work, right?
Yeah. Well, I think it gets back to that empathy, is having the desire to care, to say, hey, I want to help you. I don't know exactly what you need, but I'm willing to. Let's work at this together. Let's find a solution. And it's really, it's making that partnership in a way. And one of the things that I viewed is, be an incubator rather than an incinerator. The best thing you can do is develop somebody and help them grow, and maybe they'll grow to a different company. Well, that's fine. If they grow within your company, they're going to serve you. But if you look at everyone as, oh, they're just here to do a job short term, and I'm just going to burn them out until they do that tour of duty, to me, that's hard, because then we start creating that culture of you're only good enough for whatever you're giving me today, as opposed to I see you worth so much more. How can I help you grow into that? How can I help you develop into that?
Yeah, and we see that in different industries in different ways, but there's sort of this normalized take on what normal turnover is. So people say, oh, I work in the restaurant industry. It's totally acceptable to have 200% turnover. Or I work in automotive and we have 150% turnover. And people say, oh, that's just normal. And then I go work with these restaurant brands that have dramatically less. Or I work with these auto groups that have dramatically less. And it's whatever you believe about that is what you're going to bring into the world. Totally. And I think that's the more there's transparency of what's going on in companies, which is one of the key themes of Gen Z and Millennials, right? They're going to look at your ratings. They're going to look at your reviews. They're going to look at what employees are saying. They're going to find out who they're connected to. They're trying to make informed decisions. And it's not as hard now because it's all online and it's basically all free. So all of a sudden, what's really going on is increasingly shown, or at least different versions of that. And so you want to be careful. Now, I will tell you, and I tell this to Gen Z Millennials all the time, like, who do you think writes the ratings interview? The people that are really happy, or the people that were not happy, right? Yeah. And you got to sort of take it with a grain of salt and make sure you talk to people and you get sort of multiple different sides. But so often the idea, though, is that companies are sort of known for, like, we have an employee, our longest tenure employee, I think she's worked with us now for 13 years. And if somebody want to know what it's really like to work in my company, I'm like, well, why don't you go call Emily? She's amazing, and she'll tell you what it's really like. She's been here when we had, one employee. She's been here when we had 18 employees, right? So it's just like, really trying to understand that and letting people get a sense of that, I think, is so important. And again, not seeing it as transactional, but really seeing this as more of an agreement. Like, I'm going to help you, you're going to help me. If we do this right, we're all going to win. We're all going to move forward. Yeah. And I just think we've got to reframe a lot of that conversation. It's not about just extracting value. It's like, hey, let's work together. Let's have this shared definition of success. We don't have to agree on everything, but we can certainly directionally agree. And that, I think, people get fired up about.
Well, and even appreciating to agree for a time. Say, hey, your life is going to change. Your needs are going to change, and that's okay. And so are ours. And so that collaborative effort where you can, kind of meld back and forth.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have one question, and first, I'm going to ask it because I'm really intrigued how many people are asking it, and then dig into it. As generational, the difference between knowledge workers and physical workers, and really approaching that to say, hey, how many people, how many companies are asking about that as a real issue? Knowledge workers, physical workers, meaning knowledge workers, someone that's going to do, spreadsheet, more, however you want to describe that, as opposed to physical workers like your dad, put together a chassis, doing construction, doing, labor work. How are companies and generation, how are they viewing that?
Yeah, well, obviously I can't speak for all companies, but the ones that we tend to talk to see them a lot more alike than different, in the sense that what works with knowledge workers, because we've done a lot of work, we call them creatives, but whatever you want to call it, people that tend to work in front of a screen, is sort of how we would define it in many ways. Yes, how their workplace might look different. It might be their home. It might be their home office. They might go to some shared workspace. Maybe they hot desk, so they show up, once a week, like whatever it is. What we find, though, is what engages them is the same thing that engages the welder that's building underground pipelines, who, by the way, that's an actual client of ours. And that industry is saying, hey, how do we better recruit? Well, it turns out it looks very different than knowledge workers. How do we continually train and get people excited to work here? We're paying them really good money. So what do we do to train them so that they feel like they're valued, and we're developing their talents? And how do we get them to refer their friends and so forth? So I think companies are sort of, over time, some industries it's happened a lot faster than others, recognizing that technology really is this great through line that's going to connect these different generations and the different roles within an organization and create that knowledge share and engagement. And that's why all these interesting engagement platforms. At the same time, I think technology alone doesn't solve the problems. You still need leadership. You need people that are out there to problem solve. When you're out there in the field doing whatever it is that you're doing, like there's things that technology just won't solve. And you need to be able to, on your own and then with a team, and then know how to ask for help and actually solve it. And so I think there's a little bit of a balance between the two, but there's a lot more similarity than people would assume. In fact, I'm speaking to a company here. I just was talking to them this morning. They're been in business more than 40 years, and they're in the lawn care space, and they're using technology in all kinds of creative and innovative ways in order to drive engagement and recruiting and help the people that they serve. And like, to them, of course, you're going to do that, and you've got to continue to reinvent yourself. How else are you going to compete? So again, I think there's the best practices that work in one probably are a lot more applicable in knowledge workers with people that might have more sort of hands-on jobs than people would think. And interestingly, those hands-on jobs through this pandemic were often very secure. If you worked in manufacturing, you had to show up, you still show up. If you worked in construction, you still showed up. If you were in, all these different things, if you're in pest control, you still showed up, right? And so I think sometimes we forget that. And in fact, many of those were the most stable jobs during this period of time, where others were not able to, unless you're on the sort of far extreme, like in cloud computing and stuff. So I get excited because I think now, for the first time, when you think about things like even payroll, how people think about accessing their money and communication, how are they going to stay in touch with their bosses? And you start to look at companies, you got like Alert Media that allows you to stay connected to people in emergencies and send out messages. One company that's in the Z Economy book, you probably read it, Enborder, they do onboarding completely by text message. Well, that works whether you're working on an oil pipeline or whether you're, working in a hospital or you work for some high-tech company. Everybody, turns out, wants that. Or Instant, I think they're in the book too. I know they are, that you may have seen. They figured out how to pay all employees half their wages every day at no cost. Like, well, all of a sudden, everybody's like, well, of course I want that option. Maybe I want $20 or $70 a day. So yeah, I'm super excited about the future of work. I'm super excited about, employers recognizing that they've got to continue to adapt. And I'm really excited about these emerging generations bringing a different point of view and a skill set that I think can really add a lot of value. But mostly what I believe we still got to continue to do is celebrate those differences by generations and every other kind of difference that we bring, because that's what's going to make this work for all of us. Is we've still got to come together even though we are different. And that, I think, is so incredibly important.
Well, that is the premise that I really believe is, part of that glue and the Gen X millennial, but it is really coming to grips with and displaying empathy and, empathy, a healthy empathy. And, there's a spectrum on empathy, and it's as you've talked about so much is, hey, when we display that, when we care, when we try to find things that are good solutions for everyone, regardless of what age they are, that's a good solution for our business. And to me, that's being an empathetic leader. And that's what I'm here to champion and celebrate. So, man, great conversation. Went a lot of different ways, and I have fun sharing with people, and excited to have your book as a part of our book club and leaders be able to dig through that here this summer. I got so much value out of it. I got so much value out of it, again, thinking as a leader. How can I do a better job? How can I do a better job serving my kids and, the next generation? And so I thank you guys for all the research you're doing. And I love it. It's making me a better leader. And I know it will help others too.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Tyler. It's an honor to get to be here with you. And I know you're out there really improving the world. So thank you for what you do and how you live your life. And thrilled that Zeconomy got featured in your book club. Woohoo! Very excited to be in a book club. So thank you for that. Really appreciate it.
Oh, I'm excited to read it again for the third or fourth time with the group, and I know I'll even get more out of it. So I'm excited about that. And again, thank you for your time, and thanks for being here, man. And I really appreciate you sharing and sharing, from your heart, because I could tell.
Oh, thanks, Phil. I love this work. So thanks so much for having me on.